Wonderful, thank you, Anna. And I'm just going to start off by saying it's such an incredible honor to be sharing the stage with such an extraordinary wealth of female leadership in this country. We are all immensely privileged to be in this room. And I will also own my own privilege as a white heterosexual woman from Anglophone descent, so that we can just lay that out on the table and get table stakes out of the way. Delighted to introduce, starting with Bhutila Karpoche. Who probably needs no introduction to this group, but she is obviously the MPP for Parkdale-High Park. She is also the first person of Tibetan descent heritage to be elected in North America. Pretty damn cool. Sitting next to her is the extraordinary Michelle Woolfrey, who is a Ryerson student, a disability activist, and the owner of Blind Girls, Inc., which is a consultancy. Next to her is the fabulous Kyla Kakfwi Scott, who is Kasho Gotina from Dene, also known as Northwest Territories. She is a founding member of Dene Nahjo, which is an indigenous innovation collective, and she lives in Yellowknife with her husband and 2 daughters. Next to Kyla is Denise Siele. She is a partner at Hill Solutions, and she is a former Conservative nomination candidate in Ottawa. And last, but by no means least, it's an extraordinary personal honor to be on the same stage with Kathleen Wynne. Who put Ontario on the map as the first female out gay premier in, I think, in modern times. And is obviously now the MPP for Don Valley West. And wherever I traveled in Africa or the Middle East, and I told people I was from Ontario, they were like, oh, that's the cool province with the gay lesbian grandma who's running the show. I was like, yes, yes. I can't say that anymore. Too bad. All right, moving on. For the purposes of this panel, the title of the panel is Women, Power, and Intersectionality. And I want to make sure, again, in the interests of laying out table stakes, what we mean when we're talking about intersectionality. For the purposes of this discussion, we are referencing the extraordinary work of Kimberlé Crenshaw, who, as many of you probably know, first coined the term intersectionality in reference to the multiple barriers to opportunity that in particular Black women, but indeed any women of color, face as a result of overlapping identities. And then this was extrapolated to include class, sexual orientation, and other disability or ability and other identities. The classic example that Kimberlé Crenshaw gives is that of de Graffenried versus General Motors, in which a woman of color could not get employed in a manufacturing company's secretarial pool because of her color, nor on the shop floor because of her gender. So she was discriminated against twice over. The format will be conversational. I'll be asking a series of questions and running down the line. We have about 60 minutes for the discussion and then about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. And I'm looking forward to an amazing conversation. So without further ado, we're going to get into the first set of questions. It's about how to be both an intersectional leader and an effective representative of quote-unquote marginalized groups. So starting with Bhutila, I'd like to ask you, how in your various leadership journeys have you represented those with less access to power?
So for me, I completely understand the issues around access to power. But I think that when we talk about access to power, we're actually limiting our view in what power is, and we're accepting the traditional understanding of a very, the pyramid-style model of power where the elites are on the top. And so I think in terms of fighting for access to power, instead of everybody, every group, every person trying to climb up that pyramid and to be part of the minority, the few who have access to the table, are part of is a power broker or a decision maker. I'd like to see my work, and hopefully I'm doing the work, of actually flipping that cone and putting power back into the hands of the majority of the people. Because power shouldn't be concentrated in the hands of few, it should be distributed among the people. And that's what true democracy is. So hopefully, in terms of my work, it's not about necessarily ensuring access to power, but reminding people that we all have power in ourselves. We just need to exercise that.
Fantastic. Denise, you had an interesting response to that in we had a pre-chat, just to get to know one another a little bit better. If you wanted to just jump in on the question about representing those with less access to power.
Yeah, absolutely. I think certainly the way I've walked is to be present in those rooms and to be vocal in those rooms where, quite frankly, I have the privilege of being in. And moreover, not just vocalizing the views as I understand them from my community of interest, so Black, conservative woman, born in Kenya, and now Canadian, but also ensuring that as I enter those doors, it's not just a slight opening, but it is breaking it down so that people who look like me, who sound like me, who believe in the things that I believe in can come in, no holds barred. So I think for me, it's less about understanding access to power, but actually exercising it when you are in that room to be able to do that.
Great. And Kathleen, you had an interesting view on this when we were talking as well.
Yeah, and I'm probably going to say something different than we
Great, go for it.
But, I didn't get into elected office until I was 47 as a school trustee. And so my work in community, facilitating people coming together, whether we were fighting for good education against homophobia at the Toronto Board of Education, or whether we were tackling the anti-amalgamation fight in the city of Toronto. It was about bringing people together and helping people to find a voice and then express that voice. And so when I got into elected office, I had a different platform. We have different platforms throughout our lives, and there are tables. We talked about tables in the pre-discussion. There are tables where decisions are being made. And so what I have tried to do as an elected official is use the platforms that I've had as an MPP, as a minister, and then as premier to bring more people to those tables, to take those tables out to community and have government and outside of government working together, because there shouldn't be the separation. So in my maiden speech that I gave in 2003, I talked about my responsibility to represent all of my constituents, but I also talked about the groups that I felt, because I had been in those rooms and I had had the experience, the groups that I had a special responsibility to. So young moms who were living in isolation or in poverty, or young gay people who didn't feel that they could live their dreams or that they had access. So I think that there are those layers, and then there's the use of whatever platform we have to open up that discussion.
Fantastic. And Kyla, in our chat just before we started here, you were talking about the work that you've been doing with the collective. Could you share a little bit with the audience about why that's so important?
Yeah, so Dene and Nahjo came out of the I Don't Know More movement several years ago, which most of you are probably aware of. And in organizing around that, as people were across the country, our crew in the Northwest Territory started really talking about the what's next piece, because demonstrations are fun for a period of time, but then what are you going to do with that, to the extent that you've garnered some momentum or goodwill? How do you execute that for good and for positive change? And we have, over the years, really focused on not so much the access to power as redefining what do we consider to be powerful, and what are the spaces that we can create that just were missing before. So, Indigenous leadership values historically have been much more about the community and the collective. You don't have all of the power centered within one person. You have different people who lead in different contexts and based on the situation that you're in. And women have had historically much more of a role in that. And through imposition of leadership and power structures, it's become much more, you have one person who's the boss and it tends to be a man. And so we've really focused on trying to create spaces for the women who are leading in their communities to be able to engage and to meet each other and to not be in their community doing hard work, unrecognized and disconnected because they don't have access to the leadership forums or the cultural exchanges or things like that. And so we've just really tried to, in all of the things that we do, we really try to focus not on what is the problem and how are we talking about the problem, but what is a solution and how are we just making that happen.
Fantastic, fantastic. I have the privilege of working with an Indigenous Reporters Program, and the one piece that continually astounds me is the wealth of nuanced understanding of governance of complex communities in complex times, and I really hope that more of that can come out in this conversation. Michelle, I didn't leave you last for any other reason except for that I also know you have an additional element to add to the definition of intersectionality that, or perspective to bring. So if you'd like to share that.
So I think for myself, so talking about intersectionality, especially in a conversation like this, it's understanding that intersectionality is more than just race or gender. It includes a number of different folks' identities. And so for me, it's really important that the voices that even in conversations around marginalized communities and in equity-seeking spaces are still being ignored. So voices of the disabled, voices of the Indigenous, of trans folks, things like that. So I just, wanted to make sure that we're centering maybe a wider understanding of intersectionality in the work that we're doing. And then to answer the question around what do, I try to really, I'm a community worker, organizer, I try really hard to be in the community. I check my privilege. I make sure that I'm there to listen and not to talk. And when I do have access to tables and I have access to power, I am comfortable stepping back and allowing someone who doesn't have that access to step up and speak. And I think that we need to do more of that work.
That's great. What strategies have you used to stay connected to the various groups you represent, to ensure your leadership is informed by their perspectives, but in a situation where you have to make a hard call where your leadership is not hijacked by an identity, maybe starting with Bhutila.
Okay. For me, I think that because of my own experiences and how I came to where I am right now, right? So through community organizing, through tenant activism, through human rights freedom movements, as part of Tibet. So I come from many different experiences, and so when I'm in a position of representing the constituency, I find that my different experiences are places where I can find commonalities with people. And I think that helps inform the work that I do. But in terms of strategies, in making sure that I'm truly representing the people, I think that, and I say this especially as a member of provincial parliament, it's so easy to get lost in this bubble of Queen's Park. You think that the whole world rotates around Queen's Park when you're in there, and that real life and the real work actually is outside that building, not inside. The people are outside. Honestly, half the time people on the outside don't even know what's going on the inside. And so for me to remind myself and to be very deliberate in taking actions to always be connected to the people who are on the outside and people on the ground. So if it means that, it doesn't matter that the election's over, I still go door to door and talk to people. I tell them, what is your top of mind issue? I ask them, what am I doing different what am I doing where which I could do differently, I could do better? And for people to feel that we're working together. It's just not me being a voice at Queen's Park for them, but that actually we need to work together. So organizing initiatives like we've organized in Parkdale-High Park called Phone Your Government Nights. So everybody in the constituencies, welcome to the office. We spend an evening just phoning representatives from different levels of government on whatever issue you feel passionate about, and I'm right there with them making those phone calls. So it's really, really important to not forget that the real work is on the ground with the people. So you have to make sure you're present.
Great. Michelle?
Can I jump in on that just because we're having an elected official moment, and then we'll... So I love what Bhutila just said about the organizing locally, and it's interesting to me that as a politician, what I have experienced is that there are a couple of levels that you have to operate on, and so making sure that you keep knocking on doors, you open up your office, you have those organized opportunities within constituency to do that real work. As a minister, as a premier, I created opportunities to do real decision making with students, for example, with women, with First Nations. I met with people, I brought them in. And that's where the work got done and where the advice got sought for policy. And again, I believe that is critical. But then there are moments when there have to be symbolic actions taken. And I'll give you an example. When Black Lives Matter was camped outside the police station in Toronto, and none of the leadership was coming out to talk to them, and they came up to Queen's Park one day, and my staff were apoplectic about me going out or not going out to talk to Black Lives Matter. And there was a debate within the staff about whether I should do that. And I love those moments. I have loved those moments in my political career when someone will say, well, that hasn't been done before. Well, that's a good thing, because that means that that's something that needs to be done. And because of my background, because I had demonstrated on Queen's Park at the Board of Education. I'd been dragged out of the gallery at Queen's Park. I'd been taken down to the security, and when I first started as an MPP, some of the security guards said, oh, well, we know you. You've been around here for years. And I'm thinking, yeah, you know me because you dragged me out of the gallery. He didn't recognize, he thought, oh, you've been elected for a long time. No. I was dragged out of the gallery. So I walked out and talked to Black Lives Matter, and it was a fractious, difficult conversation, but it was really important that I make that connection, as Bhutila said, from inside Queen's Park to outside Queen's Park, because there should not be that barrier. So I just wanted to raise that symbolic piece as well.
Sure. And if we're going to continue with the sort of formal politics for a minute, Denise, if you want to share your experience of this.
Yeah, so, for me, I'm born from community, out of community, and always back to the community, right? So just to paint the picture in terms of Ottawa's Black population, there's probably about 30,000 folks who identify as Black in Ottawa, and of those about, I'd say 45% are under the age of 15, so young folks. So it's a very, very small community. And when you come from the community, there is an almost, and I'll call it awesome, an awesome accountability. The minute you step out on stage, so Denise Siele, as founder of the Black Women's Civic Engagement Network in Ottawa, automatically there are a whole cadre of people who are watching and keeping you accountable. So this is in terms of the strategy, like I think in particular in Ottawa, the community is so small and so tight-knit that there's no room for mistakes, for errors, and if anything, you will get called out when you start to step out of what is the collective, the norm, the understanding. But I'll also say this, in terms of there ought to be space as well for people to step out of what is comfortable, even within your own communities of identification. to be able to say, I will be the first to do this, that, the other. It may not capture everyone's imagination, but as Kathleen said, someone has to be the first to do it. And I think this is really the place where, as women, as intersectional leaders, we can start to push those boundaries, push them further and further until we don't need to be having these conversations about the first this, the first that, that we're all sort of engaged in this exercise of pushing things beyond your own personal limits.
Fantastic, fantastic. Michelle, you're an intersectional leader of a different path. Can you share how you've worked to stay true to your roots, so to speak, but also to be able to own conversations?
So I think as someone who doesn't hold the position that the other three individuals just spoke to, it's a little bit of a different game for me. It's maybe a little bit less of a public, it's definitely less of a public eye kind of game and more of a, I get to kind of do things the way that makes me feel good and I agree with and I feel good about. And so one of the things that I really try to do in my leadership is to continue to have those conversations around like being the first and pushing yourself outside of the comfort zone and things like that. But I also really try to stay connected to the community and what they need and what they want. And we had talked on the phone in our pre-conversation about sort of this idea of hijacking power and what do you do when the interests of the people you're representing don't necessarily line up with maybe a source or a funder or another position of power that is coming in and saying, you know, we're going to do it this way or we're going to do it that way. So how do you handle that juxtaposition? And for me, I go back to community activism and doing things like marching on Queen's Park to ensure that to ensure that the voices are continued to be heard. And I try, if I am in a position where, you know, I have to bring someone in that a community member or community members may not agree with, it's about holding space to have those difficult conversations and push ourselves outside of the comfort zone to try and see if we can get along, if we can find common ground, if we can come to some kind of an agreement about how to move forward without anyone feeling like they're being ignored or not listened to. And yeah.
And Kyla, could you speak to that from your experience with many hats?
So Dene means, if you translate it, it means the Dene way. And Dene, for those who don't know, is the name for sort of the blanket group of First Nations living in the Northwest Territories. It also extends all the way down as far as to the Navajo region, but Dene translated just means people. And so Dene is really doing things in a good way. And as a founding principle, we can't create spaces in community where we're talking about different forms of leadership, different ways of exercising power or recognizing power where it exists if we're not operating ourselves in that way. So we don't have a head of organization. There's 10 of us who are founding members. Within that group, we represent every region of the Northwest Territories, and we have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on our founding members group. And when we were first forming, part of it was that we had all had sort of what we came to discover was shared experience, but I didn't grow up in my home region. I grew up in Yellowknife because that's where my parents were. And so I grew up sort of removed from culture and removed from language, and it was lonely and kind of shameful and not something that I talked about a whole lot. And in connecting with this group of people, some of whom I knew really well and some of whom were sort of new friends and acquaintances, we discovered that that was a shared experience for all of us. And so then we figured, well, that's probably a shared experience for lots of people because 25% of the population in Yellowknife is Indigenous, and most of them are not from that place. And so we took that as our first sort of, we can infer that we are connected to and representing a community, but a need that has not actually been articulated yet. Within our group, we've got pretty diverse experience and expertise and different things that we're super passionate about. So honestly, our first circle of vetting and staying connected is that we don't do anything unless we have consensus within the group, and that takes a lot of work. So by the time we're ready to roll something out and say, here's a new project, it has gone through some serious critiquing. We also have an elders group that helps to keep us accountable, and they were the ones who at the beginning, when we were sort of apologetic for, is this even a valid thing to be trying to do and create, really said, you don't need anyone's permission to have had the experience that you've had and to want to do something about it. And so that's been incredibly valuable for us to have that support, and they leave us to do our own thing, and whenever they feel like we're veering off track, they will weigh in and let us know in their gentle elder way. And as we've gotten more involved in the community and have been rolling things out, we get a ton of feedback, and most of it honestly is about, why did you only invite 20 people to that thing? I wanted to go too. So it tends to be positive reinforcement that there is a need, and we need to scale as fast as we can so that we're able to better meet the need for everyone. But not everyone loves everything that we're doing, and we really take seriously all of the feedback that we get and go through all of it to see, is this telling us something that we didn't think about, and do we need to incorporate that into our planning going forward? Often it's stuff that actually we did spend a lot of time talking about, and we came out in the end with a decision that maybe that person didn't agree with, but it validates the process that we went through to come to the decision we came to in the end.
Amazing, amazing. Reminds me the comment about you don't need permission to own your experience. Of course, I'm reading Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, at the moment, and I just love that line where she says, my story, it's my story, and that's one thing I know I can own. And no one should ever be afraid of that. Great. So Denise, you had touched on a point where, the idea of wanting to get to a place where no one ever has to be the first or out of their comfort zone in order to be able to lead from a place of intersectionality. And I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit in the context of the question, what do you want to see change so that this kind of panel represents leadership in Canada, no need for any additional flags? What would you like to see change?
There's a whole list of things, but and I think probably the most difficult piece for me as a Black woman is from within my own community to remove this sense and idea that we're all one and the same, right? So it has to, in some ways, it has to start from within, right? How are we organizing as a Black community in Ottawa to be able to move forward? And I think the really tricky thing here is that there's sometimes this sense, and I'm going to be really, really frank with this audience here, is a lot of folks look at me and they just see a Black woman. That's it, that's all. Not understanding that I'm Anglophone African, that someone in the audience could be Francophone from the Caribbean, could be Muslim from Somalia, wherever it is, or even Afro-Nova Scotian. And so there's that immediate issue of being able to say that collectively we are Black, but there's also a need for all of everyone, not all of everyone, but everyone else to understand that when you see a Black person, it does not represent one and the same. There's so much diversity. And this is the thing that I think in terms of being able to change, it's, if there's a founding group, the Federation of Black Canadians, that's trying to sort of have this one collective voice for the Black community across Canada, but also look for our elected officials until we can have people who look like us in those spaces to be able to tease out those differences and those understandings. It's going to be really, really difficult, but heading into next week is Black History Month, right? So we think about greats like Lincoln Alexander, and we think about Rosemary Brown, and we think about Jean Augustine, and these are people who are have been able to begin that conversation for us in really meaningful ways. So I will say this, as an audience, it's not enough to be allies for the Black community, for Black women, but it's also important to be very, very vocal in the understanding of the diversity, even within this small group.
Fantastic. Michelle, you were nodding vigorously through that. What do you want to add?
I think I like 1,001% agree with everything that you said. The other thing that I would add to it is that that I would like to see changed is to stop the sort of tokenizing of leaders who don't look like what we understand leaders to look like. So whether that's their people of color, whether that's their disabled, indigenous, trans, from the LGBT community, whatever it may be, I really wish that we could stop tokenizing people and saying, oh, well, she got that position because she's indigenous, or she got that position because she's disabled, and they just wanted to make the disabled community happy. When Kathleen first got elected, a lot of the commentary that I heard in my circles in my community was, well, she's a lesbian leader, she's a gay leader. And I think that that's very important to acknowledge that, someone from a community who doesn't traditionally get represented is in that position. But I think it's also really important that we don't necessarily just focus on that identity. Kathleen got into that space because she is an amazing woman who has done amazing work. I stand at the front of a lecture hall and give a lecture, and I'm not there because I'm some disabled person who they want to talk about accessibility, and so they're trying to throw a bone to the disability community. I'm there because I'm intelligent and I'm smart and I have the background and the knowledge and the lived experience to walk in those shoes. And so I think for me, that is the one thing that I would really like to change is people stopping looking at when someone who is other or doesn't look like they should be in that leadership position is why don't we just critically think about it?
Kyla, the change question. What needs to change?
I think that that really deep and perpetual questioning and thinking through and working through identity that that people with intersecting minority identities have to do as a matter of course. Everything in my life is filtered through that I'm a woman and that I'm indigenous and I'm an indigenous woman, and those are all three different things. That I'm a mom, that I'm a full-time working mom, that I work for the government that many of my people don't even acknowledge as being a legitimate government, that I have this organization that we formed because we think it's meeting a need, but no one asked us to form it, we just did it ourselves. There's all of those things, and none of those are things that are detriments to my work. Those are the things that make it possible for me to do the work that I'm doing. Those are the things that make me a valuable and contributing member of my community. But I feel like it's expected that people sort of interrogate the things that make them different from the norm, which I hate, but that's what it is. But I think that needs to be something that everyone does, because everyone has intersecting identities, and everyone should have to do the work of questioning that. And I am often struck by that in this current, big R reconciliation state that we're in this country, because there's so much discussion about it, and there is, I think, far too much talk about it from a systemic and a far away and the big pieces that we need to be doing, and really not enough taking home as the personal work that you were doing that no one else ever needs to know about or hear about, honestly, but it needs to happen, and it needs to happen for everyone in the country and become the new norm. I think that's the change that I would really like to see.
Bhutila.
Sure. So for me, the message of change, I think I will focus it on the progressives. because I'm assuming many of you in the room here identify as a progressive, is that I find that among progressives, we are satisfied with incremental changes, small steps, you know? And I find that when we don't have the courage to be bold, to think big, to make transformational change, then that incremental steps that you're trying to take is really not helping a lot of people, and it really is not helping people with many marginalized intersecting identities. Because if you really think about it, who has the luxury of time? A homeless person doesn't have luxury of time, not somebody on ODSP, not somebody who's trying to flee violence. So time is of the essence, and people get cynical about even progressive governments because you campaign with optimism, you are full of spirit, and there's momentum during the election campaign, and the moment you form government, back to status quo governance. And so this is what is also deterring people from getting engaged in political processes. And I think that, and you know what, look at Ford. The right is showing us how actually quickly you can make changes. I mean, they're doing it in the completely opposite direction, but once any progressive government gets in, my gosh, you have no more excuses to say that change cannot be dramatic, cannot be transformational, and you know, cannot be done quickly.
Great. And then I'm going to pass it on to someone who I think was leading a transformational change agenda.
Yeah, that went well.
Kathleen.
It did. Somebody asked me, somebody said to me it was brave of me to come and sit here today after what happened to us. I'm proud of what we did. So, you know, we got turfed out on our ass for lots of reasons, but you know, some of those reasons were that we did a lot and we did it as quickly as we could. But I want to, you know what, I want to just talk as the oldest person probably in this room, but certainly sitting up here. It really pains me. I was feeling a bit emotional when you were asking the question, Rachel. It pains me that the echo of and some of the same words that we were using in 1967 are words that we're using today. So the pace of change from my perspective has been not nearly rapid enough. And I'm talking about attitudinal shifts. I'm talking about a move towards a more inclusive society that I think is the foundation for a socially just society. And of course, we've made progress. We have made huge progress. But I think what we're seeing right now with right-wing populism is that a lot of those attitudes that, I don't know, we thought we had, maybe we just thought we'd push them underground, maybe we thought they actually had changed, are still there. And they are so toxic and so dangerous. And we could have a whole conversation about what social media does to encourage and embolden and create those echo chambers for that toxicity. But I come back to, if we don't teach children, if we don't provide an opportunity for children to experience the world differently, if we have only those big conversations about truth and reconciliation and about jurisdiction, and we don't have the curriculum that we were working on that would have taught our history differently, if we don't do that, we're not going to change attitudes. If we don't observe and intentionally create classrooms and schools where equity is paid attention to and where teachers have done the self-reflection so that they understand why it's important and give kids the space to do it. If we don't do that work, then we're not going to shift the attitudes that we all want to see shifted. So there are structural changes that we can make. You know, we can demand that there are more women on boards. We can create more inclusive environments in those power brokering environments. But if we don't if we don't create a better place for kids to grow up in, then those attitudes are not going to shift. And so I think that we've got to work from both sides.
That's great. One hell of a panel. And that brings me, I'm going to slightly fast forward a little bit through the questions we discussed before to the urgency question of why this matters so very much. And I think what has been happening in the United States over the past 3 weeks really beautifully illustrates why it matters so much. We see a Congress that is full of, on one side of the House, a smorgasbord of women of experience of all kinds who've put themselves forward and said, enough is enough, this is not my America, and I want to do things differently. And then you've got the other side who are stonewalling, literally stonewalling, in order to stop that progress. And so it really, for me anyway, is one of the most urgent topics that we need to get right. But I want to hear from all of you in terms of why this is so crucial at this moment in our democracy, starting with Bhutila.
I think that for democracy to truly work and be what it is, it has to be participatory. And unfortunately, the system that we have right now is not a true participatory democracy. I mean, the figures in our voter participation rate is one indicator. It's always less than 50% of the votes deciding who becomes government and gets 100% of the power. And I think that in order to have true participatory democracy, we have to engage with people who are what we term as the non-voters, or the people who are not engaged in the politics. And if we want to engage them, then our message has to be something that resonates with them. It has to be bold. It has to address their needs. They have to feel like, okay, she understands my problem. She knows what the real causes of the societal problem is or whatever. And that the message has to be something that people feel that they can believe in. And for them to not be cynical, not to have people promise the same things and again go back to status quo governance, to really work day in and day out to make sure that the message that you were trying to bring forward that resonated with the people is something that you will continue to work on no matter the political landscape, no matter the political situation.
Denise, you cast your lot with the conservative side of the aisle. Can you unpack that in the context of the question about urgency, getting this right?
I would say that we need to move democracy from an abstract understanding, right? And I think this is in many ways with many of the folks that I work with, it's some far off thing. It doesn't really exist, but it exists in very real ways for them in terms of community, right? How they engage with community. So you can talk to a mother, a single mother of 4 kids who's working, the night shift. She doesn't have time to go to Queen's Park and march or go down to, Parliament Hill and decry this or that government policy. But what she is doing in her very own space in terms of making sure that her kids are able to go to school and is active on parent-teacher council. So that's just one example. So this idea of democracy as being abstract, I would suggest that, and certainly for me as a conservative, that's how I approach it, right? It's really grounded in community. And that's where we can start to see the kind of transformational change, whether you're coming from the progressive side or whether you're coming from a more fiscally responsible component. I had to throw that in there, and so for me, the core piece here is how are we engaging in our own individual ways in our communities of interest.
Democracy is a verb. Kathleen?
Yeah, I just want to reinforce that notion of people in your own lives, what you're doing. And I had fights when I was doing my Masters of Education at Oise, I had arguments in a lot of courses because I was at home working part-time, going to school. I had 3 kids. I wasn't going to marches. I wasn't part of that activist community, but I was causing a lot of trouble at the school board, and I was helping other people in the neighborhood with their kids. And I think that it is really important when kids ask me, did I know I was going to be premier? Was it a plan? And how can they get involved? I always say to them, it's not about joining a party necessarily. It's about being interested in something, and it's about taking action in your own school, whether you're in grade 5 or whether you are in post-secondary or whether you're in your community. Be interested, find a way to be involved, and that then teaches you the skills that you take from that community into whatever forum you find yourself in. So I think democratic households, a family that allows for volatility and allows for conversation is a really important thing. It doesn't have to be yelling, although in our family there was lots of high decibels. I'll just say that for my family members and friends who are in the audience, if they think I'm pretending that somehow we had intellectual discussions. But having a place at home where it's okay to disagree and where dad's not going to or mom's not going to lay down the law, that teaches kids that it's safe to express themselves. So it starts right from the beginning, the democratic process. And it's really, I know that wasn't even your question. It's really important right now because it's under threat. Our democratic system is under threat from that right-wing populism that I was talking about, and I think conservatism, there's a whole range, right? And I think that we can't apply those labels to every single person who calls himself a progressive or calls himself a conservative. There are continuums in every way. But right now, when we've got people in leadership roles saying, I'm not going to talk to the media, and the media isn't real, and believe us because we're going to create our own news, that's really scary, and we should all be very anxious about that kind of leadership.
As a journalist, very much agreed. Michelle, on the topic of the urgency piece, and in particular from your unique perspective.
I think for me, it's urgent because people are literally dying in the streets, and we have systems that are okay with turning their backs on those people and letting them literally die in the streets, and not be able to feed themselves and house themselves and clothe themselves, and just take care of their basic human needs. And when we talk about individuals getting involved in the democratic process and speaking up and sharing their views and their values, it's hard to do that when you can't afford rent and you can't put food on your table. And so for me, urgency is because we're facing a crisis where people I think we're going in the wrong direction. And when I work in community and I talk to community, and I hear the struggles that they're going through, I'm a disabled university student who eats a fair amount of craft dinner because that's what I can afford. When we look at it, we just need to, that isn't sustainable, and that isn't how we make any kind of change. We need to be able to support people and give them what they need and look after their own basic needs before we can expect them to become MPPs and conquer the world.
And Kyla.
I really appreciate Kathleen's comments, because I think, much as I think democracy is wonderful, the reality of being a minority is that you cannot elect your way to fair representation. You cannot possibly have leadership that, by virtue of being of your community, is going to make decisions that are right for your community. And so it has to be the people. It has to be everyone. And the urgency of not doing that, the risk of that, is that everyone who is not you is some special interest group that needs to be consulted but does not weigh as importantly in your decision making as the people who are just like you. And that, you know, as Michelle said, that's not, oh, that might hurt people's feelings. That has life and death implications for people. And there's no small expressions of power that come out of that. I work in my day job for the government of Northwest Territories in health and social services. And we've been doing a lot of work on cultural safety and cultural competency. And in a presentation a few weeks ago, and this is on the public record, so I'm comfortable talking about it, but we had a former minister of health and social services who is Indigenous, who talked about their experiences while they were in that position, receiving racist treatment in the healthcare system. And I'm in Toronto for the next few days. When I'm at home, I'm sort of immune from it because we have 50% of the population in the NWT and people know who I am. No one knows who I am in Toronto, and no one particularly cares. And tomorrow when I'm in my regular weekend clothes, because this is not actually a typical Saturday outfit for me, and I'm out doing some shopping in a hoodie, odds are excellent that someone is going to follow me around the store. And that is not okay. But that is my lived reality, and that is the lived reality for every other visibly brown person in this room and in every room in this country. And that is not something that we can change for ourselves. And that is not something that elected leadership alone can change for us, because they are serving the population that elected them. So really, the population needs to get it and think it's important as well.
And that's a beautiful segue to how do we make this different? And also responding to the question, why is it crucial that it's not all on these extraordinary intersectional leaders in order to make this situation different? Kyla, I'm going to start with you. What's the call to action for everyone in this room?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think I really think it's about what is the personal commitment that each of you makes leaving the room? What is the personal commitment that we expect of our friends and our family and our coworkers and all of the people that we have the ability to touch in our lives? We started our work with Dene really trying to meet needs for ourselves, and we've been doing it for 5 years now, so we all qualified more as youth at the time. Now we get invited to youth things and we're like, oh, we're a bit old for that. But we have kids, many of us. And I realized at some point in the early parts of doing the work that I was trying to fix things for myself, that I hadn't had access to learning my language. And my kids were growing so fast that I was, in trying to fill that void for myself, missing my opportunity to do that for them. And so that's really become part of the work that we're trying to do and the way that we work, so the kids are part of it. My 10-year-old came to a strategic planning meeting last week and took notes, very cute, and contributed her thoughts about what we should be working on for the year. And that's the kind of change that I think makes a difference over time, is not just how are you teaching your kids, but how are you engaging them in the work, because they don't suddenly turn 18 and think, oh, now I should care about democracy. I mean, you teach your kids to vote from the very first time that they're old enough to register that you're voting. You teach them to care about people other than themselves and their own friends and family and circle by exposing them to other circles and embedding within them the value of every life. And so I think that's critically important, and I think it's also something that I know for our group is something that we care a lot about, and we do a lot of work. I mean, this Dene is not my job. It is a volunteer thing that takes up about a full-time job's worth of time that I do in addition to my other job, and in addition to being a student, and in addition to being a mom and a partner and a daughter and all of the other things that I am to the people in my life. And I hope that my kids don't have to work that hard at it. I hope that that is something that is shared equally with everyone that they are working with and for, so that it is not their burden to carry alone, and it's not their responsibility. in the same way that it feels like a compelling and heavy responsibility sometimes. Also a privilege. I love the work that I do, and I'm super lucky to be able to do it, but it doesn't feel like I can take a day off from it, and that's a lot.
Great. Kathleen?
I want to go back to something that Bhutila said at the beginning about power, and I think the shout out to everyone is that there is positional power, and then there is the power that I think Bhutila was talking about that each person has, and that's where I was going when I was talking about each of us in our own lives. So I think challenging people, speaking up is really important, and finding the people who can support you in speaking up, you know, because sometimes it's really hard to do. I mean, to Michelle's point about, you know, if you're trying to put food on the table and you don't have access to, you know, comfort or even subsistence, then you need support. So those of us who can be supporters, we need to do that, but all in the interest of including all those voices. And I think everybody in this room has the ability to do that. And that is the most powerful thing that we can do. And it will be different. You know, I look out at this room, it'll be different for each of you. You know, it will mean something different for each of you. Some of you are teachers, some of you are students yourselves, some of you are working in business, but you all have opportunities to raise issues that haven't been raised before, do something in a different way, bring in a different voice, and create a bit of discomfort. When Denise talks about pushing against the edges, discomfort is not a bad thing. Conflict is not a bad thing. You know, we have to be able to have conversations where we don't agree with one another and where we don't heckle each other to the point where we can't actually even think about finding common ground. That is so destructive, and that's what is polarizing. So to the degree that you can, yes, find your allies and raise your voice, but raise your voice in places where you're not going to have agreement. It's not going to be an echo chamber. That's where change happens. And so I guess my shout out would be, you know, go be uncomfortable.
Rachel, I think that would be a great segue to get some questions from the audience. Because of the call to action that Kathleen gave us right now.
Fantastic. So perspectives from all of you. You're all part of this. Questions from the audience.
It's hard to see. Here we go.
Hi there. Thanks so much for the insights and the perspectives that you've provided. My question is more related to some of what you talked about in terms of tokenism, pushing against the edges, and this concept of firsts. I guess my concern is not about the firsts, but the nexts, and that those firsts don't become the only. And at times I feel like where we make strides, we tend to think, okay, check, we had our first, and where is that succession plan? Where are the individuals that we're developing to take our places once we move on to the next position? So just getting some perspective. I think you've touched on a little bit in terms of bringing youth along, but how do we combat ensuring that we're not just leaving them as the onlys?
Yeah. Do you want to take
I would thank you for that question, because I think just even in talking to some of the firsts that are within my circle, it is such a struggle for them to even get to be that first. And once you're in there, you breathe. And and let's understand this, right? That next to, behind, beside every one of those people who are the first, so I think about like Jean Augustine. She struggled, she worked hard, and when she was finally in office, she had to take a breath and literally be able to pause and ponder and look, understanding that it's representing your community in this place that no one has ever been, and then the sheer weight of expectation. And that is probably the most challenging thing. So I would say in terms of the next, let's do a good job of supporting First of all, the first. So we talk about women in politics. It's one thing to get them elected. Let's make sure they stay elected, right? So it's part of that move.
Yeah, and I think on that, I think we've got a big problem. You know, the fact is that women premiers don't get reelected. When I became the leader and therefore the premier before the 2014 election, so for that year 2013, there were 6 female premiers in this country. And I would be asked by the media, oh, well, is this, have we now broken through? Are we into a new reality? No, there are not 6 female premiers anymore. And so we've got a lot of work to do around bias, and we need to pull apart what goes on. So do people get sick of the sound of our voices? Yeah, I think so. I said at the end of during the election campaign, I said to some of my team, I just want to go out and say, I'm not your mother, I'm not your teacher, I'm not your grandmother. So put that aside and listen to what the hell I'm saying. So, so I think naming it, trying to pull it apart, and then for those of us who have been in those positions, to use the experience to encourage others, and one of my projects at the moment is to articulate, because young people come up to me and say it was so tough and people said such awful things about you, and I want to come back and say, yeah, but it was worth it. It was so worth it because of the changes that we were able to make. So I think that's important, to encourage people coming along.
Sure. I'll just, want to echo what was already said, because we have to remember that when we do have these firsts, the reason we kind of even take a moment to acknowledge the first is because currently the system is designed not to have certain people in positions of power. The system is designed not to elect certain people. So that is why we have, these occasions where we have these firsts. And then we have to remember that the system hasn't changed. So that person, whoever is the first, is going to have to fight to survive and fight to be heard. It's a constant battle in a system that's not designed in your favor. And so if we want to continue the work, absolutely, but it has to be not just the person who is elected, it has to be us as a community to continue to push and to continue to build on that work so that it doesn't become just one first and then you've never heard about somebody else, the second or the next. And so that kind of leadership building for others to come forward takes a lot of time and investment, and it takes a lot of discomfort and sacrifices, but it has to be done.
I think we have time for one more question. One more question.
I'd like to ask a question as an old white man. And I don't want to pull rank on our former premier, but I don't think she's the oldest person in the room. To what extent, well, let me just ask you about the nature of the obstacles you face. Are they changing? Are they becoming bigger? To what extent is it associated with gender? To what extent is it associated with race? Could you just say something about the enemy?
Actually, this kind of came up in our discussions a little bit too. And it goes back to if you, as an older white man, identify yourself as an ally to a movement or an issue, one, you have to remember that you're not just an ally by name, but you are an ally by action. And so you have to go and take that second step to take action. But when you do want to take that action, be very thoughtful about what action it is that you're taking, because you don't want to hurt or impede progress of the work that is being done. Do you stand behind the person that you're trying, or the issue that you're trying to be an ally to? Maybe you stand behind, maybe you stand beside, but you never stand in front of it. And so to understand that you as an ally have a great responsibility. And when we talk about the enemy, Martin Luther King's famous quote about how the civil rights movement, the enemy or the the biggest obstacle was not the Klan's members, but in fact, it was the white moderates who impeded progress. So as allies, we have to play a greater role in making sure that we are not in the way of impeding progress for any issue or cause.
Thank you for that, because I think it's really important to say that acknowledging all of these things to be true does not make you the enemy. And I also, personally, because my dad is Indigenous, my mom is non-Indigenous, so I have all sorts of wonderful white men in my family. I think, though, and you often, if someone is critiqued for their stance on women and the response is, well, I have daughters, and so, right? Or I have friends who are black, and so. My non-Indigenous family, of course, loves me like family, but there's nothing, I am both as unique as every other Indigenous woman in the country and as the same in facing structural barriers as every other Indigenous woman in the country. And so their responsibility cannot just be to me and my brother and sister, it needs to be to everyone. And that is true for all of us. I think one of the things to really, and this ties into the earlier question also, is as you are opening yourselves to being aware of barriers and to trying to find ways to address them, that question of tokenism is a huge one. And it is, I think, something that's really tricky to navigate in the first only different category. Because when you are so excluded from power, anytime something is offered, it's hard to say no to it. But you can end up saying yes to stuff that doesn't actually come with any influence. And I mean, how many organizations have responded to the need to better respect the Indigenous peoples of this country and the real history of this country by creating new advisory entities, which have no power. It's a way to say, sure, we're doing this, yay for us, and bringing people into the institution. If you want to have a more representative organization, put Indigenous people on your board. There's lots of them who are super qualified. Look at your hiring policies and how they're creating barriers to bringing people in for no particular reason. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that can be questioned and tends not to be. It's rather than looking at if this is a structural problem, if this is a systemic issue, let's look at our systems and see how we can fix them. And instead people are saying, well, how can we put a new coat of paint on our system that makes us feel better about the work that we're doing? And that's really dangerous because it creates the illusion of change without addressing any of the root problems. So that would be my response to that.
Michelle, you were nodding a lot just then. Can you share your perspective on that one?
I have a few things to say. So I mean, kind of what popped into my mind as you were talking, Kyla, was like this concept of allyship, and how folks call themselves allies. They are an organization and they say we're allying with Indigenous communities by hiring or by creating this advisory committee that again has no support. And I think that for me, I really don't like the word allyship. I think that it is actually part of the enemy, if you want to call it that, or the problem. And it allows folks to continue to perpetuate the hegemony and the patriarchy and the ableism and the racism and the sexism, but they're allies, so it's okay. And so I think we need to be really critical of that. And then the other thing I was going to say is that, kind of going back to that tokenism piece, we need to stop. When I walk into a room, I recently had this experience where I walked into a room and I spoke, and someone came up to me afterwards, someone in a position of power, theoretically more power than I had, and said I was really smart for a disabled person. So it's that kind of attitude that we need to change. And that isn't something that I can do as a disabled leader shouting off from my soapbox at Queen's Park. That's something that all of you need to do, and maybe that's the true definition of allyship.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, because this is the job that we have to do. And I just want to thank this amazing, amazing group of women who, as you can see, we could talk about this all day. Unfortunately, we can't, but let's give them a big round of applause for